John, thank you very much for joining us here.
It's my honor. Thank you.
It's really a privilege for all of us in Delhi. Many people are here from outside Delhi also. And to give you an indication of the energy, you saw John running up the stairs and I was walking up the stairs. John has been on his toes throughout the day and is about to catch a flight after this. So thank you, John, again very much. It's amazing to listen to you, and I'm sure the audience will also enjoy this. You took over as the chairman of Cisco, or you took over as the CEO of Cisco around 76 when the revenue was around $60–70 million. Mm-hmm. And today when you stepped down about a month back, I think it was about $48 billion. That's an amazing journey. Mm-hmm. How did you accomplish this? It's just magical.
Well, I want to be very upfront. There's no substitute, as everybody in this room knows, for being in the right market at the right time. So being associated with the internet is very key. But also, it was a lesson learned because I'd come from experience with IBM, which was on top of the world and lost its way, and it took them 20 years to recover. And from Wang Laboratories, with Dr. Ann Wang, smartest man I've ever met, we missed one market transition from mini computers to PCs and softwares, and 32,000 people lost their job. So when I joined Cisco and saw the opportunity, first I visualized what was possible and set the pace both with our board and our employees that we were going to play for it all, to change the world, if you will, at a time that we were only 70 million in sales. And what we did is we reinvented ourselves constantly. We moved from being a router company to a switch company. We got market transitions right. We got the voice coming to the internet and voice being free, country digitization, etc. And what I'm really sharing is that the industry is very good, but we kept reinventing ourselves. And it's easy to say, but really hard to do. So I think what Cisco did that allowed us to be successful, we got market transitions right. We were phonetically driven by our customers. We combined our products into architectures that produced outcomes, and we were fearless as we took on our competitors.
So that's interesting. You called it right many times. You did a right call many times. Did you go wrong any time?
Yes, on both. You know, very often people ask, how do you see around corners or how you see the future? I've always been mining data constantly. And by the time you listen to your customers, the industry experts, your partners, you listen around the world, you can feel the pulse of trends occurring. And then maybe in part because I'm dyslexic, I can connect the dots, I can go A, B, Z pretty well. But anybody who tells you they've been able to be very successful in certain areas and they haven't had setbacks is not being honest with you. If you're pushing the envelope, you're going to have mistakes or you're going to have misses, and you've got to feel comfortable that when that occurs, you've got to realize you should have your board on board and your shareholders on board with the risk you're taking. I'll share with you, you shared kindly the success in terms of going from 400 people to 75,000 people, to be in 1 or 2 and 16 out of 18 product areas with over 40% market share. Nobody's ever done that. But in our acquisition strategy, where we acquired 180 companies, I had some misses, and I told the market there'd be misses. And in our industry, 90% of high-tech acquisitions fail. If you say, do you gain market share? Was it a good financial decision for your shareholders? Did you keep the engineers and get the next generation product out? But when you do fail, often you get criticized, and you have to be prepared for that. But the one that I'm criticized the most on was a product called Flip, a camcorder capability, and I paid $600 million for it. And it was our movement into the consumer base. We were already in the set-top boxes for video. It was a logical extension. But however, when we moved into that market, my team fell in love with the product as opposed to the video being the real benefit and putting it in the cloud. Apple announced the product for free. Steve Jobs said, this is a wonderful product, look at Cisco's product. And then he said, we're going to give it to you for free. And he outmaneuvered me, and I closed it down in 6 months. $600 million I paid for it. And many people would say, wasn't that a big mistake? And my answer was, no, I told you I was going to miss at least 1 out of 3. The other 2 acquisitions I did that year, I paid $2.7 billion for and $3.1 billion. Both of them were tremendously successful, but nobody wrote
Nobody
about
knows
that. And so one of the things about leadership, it's going to be lonely. And secondly, you want to tell your shareholders, the market, that things are going to occur. You'll still get criticized on it, but you have to have the courage of when you do things that others have not done, you're going to have some missteps along the way. You can call them mistakes. I personally view it more as that's just the breakage you're going to have. It's like a portfolio play in your business where maybe 30% of your companies won't work out, and that's a higher hit rate than almost everybody else has, but still 30% won't work out. Same thing in my business.
You mentioned acquisitions.
Yes.
Now, I remember you talking about the speed of acquisition, the process of acquisition. Do take us through perhaps one of your more famous acquisitions, which was very expensive, even in today's world, WebEx and Crescendo.
Yes, it was interesting. No matter how much you tell the market that you're going to be acquiring companies, and by definition, if you're acquiring a company that's very valued already in the market or by the venture capitalists, you're going to pay a premium. And the only way that's a good acquisition for you is if you get the next product out the door and you gain market share. And so the first acquisition we did was a company called Crescendo, I got that because two of my customers told me there was a transition occurring, something called Fast Ethernet versus ATM, and Ford Motor Company, and I apologize for those of you who were in the last session, some of the young Turks that were startups. I think there are 20 of you in the room who were there, but basically Ford said, John, ATM to the desktop isn't going to be the way of the future. It isn't so important what ATM is, it's where 95% of the industry experts thought the market was going to go. They said, John, it's going to be Fast Ethernet, and I had to have Ford explain to me what it was. And then 2 weeks later, I'm at Boeing, and Boeing said, you know, John, I think ATM to the desktop, we're going to go with an interim step. And I said, yeah, I know it's going to be Fast Ethernet. They looked at me like, how did you know that? And I said, well, can I have my order now? And they said, no, you got to go buy Crescendo. And I acquired Crescendo for $92 million for a company with $10 million in revenue, and my stock dropped dramatically the next day. That company now contributes directly and indirectly $13 billion a year. And so leadership is lonely. When you're on the bleeding edge, often people don't give you credit for being able to see around corners, although they did later in our career there. The WebEx one you referred to, this speaks about speed of process. One of the things that allowed us to move with such tremendous speed at Cisco, and most people would say at times we moved too fast, I personally don't agree with that, but was that we'd have a replicatable process behind it. So we had a replicatable process on acquisitions, how do we decide which ones to do, what are the golden rules that would cause us to be more successful than most other people who did it. But I got a call on a Thursday night from a person by the name of Al Berkeley, who was head of the NASDAQ stock exchange, and he said, John, there's a company that you should have already acquired, and two of your competitors have been in there for over 6 months, and it's going to be a multi-billion-dollar acquisition, and it belongs to be part of you, and why haven't you moved faster? And I said, well, what's the name of it? And he said, WebEx. And I said, I apologize, Al, I don't even know what they do. So I was a little bit embarrassed. And he said, you need to really acquire this company, and I trusted him. And so I went to my business development guy, and I said, we need to acquire WebEx, I think. I want you to go check it out. He didn't know who they were either. He went over the next morning at 8 o'clock in the morning, met with the CEO, and he called me back within 2 hours and said, John, you got to get over here. I went over, met with the CEO. By 1 o'clock, we had a handshake for a $3.2 billion acquisition. I took the risk of assuming my board would back me. We got it through my board, his board, announced it Monday morning. Our competitors didn't even know we were in the account. So speed of a replicatable process is very, very key. And one of the lessons about leadership is I still get more criticized on the Flip acquisition that failed for $600 million than I do the $3.2 billion acquisition that was very successful. So that's just part of the world we live in.
Startups.
Yes.
Learning for startups on reinvention. You mentioned you reinvented fairly often, first in perhaps 5 to 7 years and then now 3 years.
Yes.
How important is reinvention for startups?
You know, it's a good question because all of us have to reinvent ourselves in order to be successful. Startups have to do it to survive. So really successful CEOs or startups will reinvent themselves. In today's world, you have to do it almost every 3 to 4 years, because that's how fast the market is changing, that's how fast customer expectations are changing, that's how fast technology is changing. When I started, you had to do it every 5 to 7 years. So for a startup, it's something the CEOs in this room have to learn how to do and build it into your DNA. For large companies, most CEOs cannot reinvent themselves. And I really didn't understand that. And one of my toughest competitors, who you can probably figure out who it was, Dutch background, ran BT and then ran Alcatel-Lucent, came up to me one day and he gave me a compliment and he said, "John, I just want to compliment you on how you reinvented yourself in Cisco, and you've done it 4 or 5 times." And I was actually in shock because he almost never said anything nice to me. And I said, "Well, thank you. That's why I believe a CEO has to be in the job more than 5 or 6 or 7 years to really be successful." And he said, "Now we're going to disagree." He said, "Most CEOs cannot reinvent themselves of large companies." He said, "I don't reinvent myself. I go to a different company about every 4 to 5 years. And I thought about it a little bit, and he said, "Well, how many CEOs do you think really reinvent themselves?" And I thought about it and I didn't buy what he was saying. Then he said, "All right, how many of your top 100 managers have you ever left in the same job for 5 years or more and you found they reinvented themselves and were very successful in it, versus how many did you have to change?" And he had me. Out of my top 100 managers, only one in the entire history of the company I had left in the job more than 5 years and not either had to change them or move them later because their performance dropped off, a guy by the name of Joe Pinto. And that's a key takeaway point. For large companies, for whatever reason, very few CEOs can reinvent themselves. They almost have to bring in a new CEO to take the company to the next level. So I'm very proud of what we did at Cisco. During my tenure, we probably reinvented ourselves 5 or 6 times. Chuck Robbins, the current CEO, is reinventing the company again. And reinvention is a key part. Large companies, often the CEO has to transition. Startups, if you have to transition the CEO every 3 years, you're going to fail. And so the CEOs of the startups, you all have to learn how to reinvent themselves and readjust as the company scales, readjust your management style, readjust how the market's going to occur, et cetera. It's going to be part of the DNA.
What's the difference for a startup between CEO and founder? When does the founder, who's also the CEO in the beginning, take a call that he needs a CEO? And how does he do that?
It's one of the questions we got asked in the last session with the young Turks, if you will, of the software startups that you pulled together. First, the fact that the CEO asked it showed tremendous maturity. And being very candid as an investor or as an acquirer, I did not like it when I had to change CEOs or the CEO couldn't take the company to the next level. There was a direct correlation between the 180 companies I acquired and how many of them did I hold the CEO, especially if they were the founder and the engineering brilliance behind the company, and whether that acquisition was successful for me. As an investor, if I start to invest and realize I'm going to have to change the CEO or they're going to have to change themselves, I usually don't invest. So I personally like the CEO reinventing themselves and seeing that they can. However, I think it's very realistic that if the CEO is really the brilliance behind the company and is the engineering mind doing it, but they really don't enjoy, but also not good at the operations, the interface to investors, the others, it's very mature to say, really, I should be the chief scientist or chief strategist or the chief technical officer, and I need to bring in a CEO. So it has to do with both when does the CEO really not enjoy what they're doing, because if you're not enjoying it, your team will see it and you won't be successful. Or when you have to be realistic, you either can't reinvent yourself or you can't scale with the company in terms of the approach. Sure. And so I think it's a mature approach to do. My suggestion is when a CEO finds themselves in that position, they go to 1 or 2 confidants and get their advice. and then decide about bringing in the CEO or not.
Culture.
Yes.
Startups start with a few people, 10, 20, 30, go up to 200, 300, 5,000.
Yes.
How important is culture of an organization in a startup environment? So you've got markets changing, products changing, financing going up and down.
Yes.
Everything is changing around you.
Yes.
How do you build a culture, and is that important to the success of a startup?
I wouldn't have articulated when I first became CEO, and at Wang I'd already managed 10,000 people. So going to managing 400 was a culture shock down. And I didn't understand how important culture was to a company, although I started building the culture without calling it that from the very beginning in terms of being customer-oriented, innovation, just do the right thing type of approach. I think the job of a CEO is only 4 areas: vision and strategy for the company, develop, retain, recruit, and change the leadership team to implement that vision and strategy, culture, and communications. It's one that most young CEOs and startups don't realize how important it is, and it's something that's got to be owned by the CEO. It has to be her or his culture that they really stand behind. You may like the culture at Microsoft, you may not. You may like it at Oracle, you may not. You may like it at Cisco or not. You never have great companies without a very strong culture. And so the CEO, she or he, has to own it. They've got to articulate it constantly. They've got to walk the talk on it. And I think it's one of the 4 most important things the CEO does.
When you say culture, what are the basic elements which founders should look at when they're building culture? So what are the elements of culture?
So the elements of culture are the values that you want. Let me just share with you these of Cisco, and what would surprise you, what were the cultural issues that we drove at the very early stage of the company are still the core values we do today. For us, culture is just make innovation happen. Culture is being customer driven. Culture is just do the right thing. Culture is treat your peers and your customers like you'd like to be treated yourself. Culture is our mission statement of changing the world, works, lives, learns, and plays, and I really meant it, and driving that through. So I think culture is what is so key. I'll give you an example of a challenge. We got challenged by the Security and Exchange Commission and the Justice Department about a whistleblower issue in Russia. And in Russia, when you go through channels, etc., most every company has major problems with that. When they challenged us, and it was by somebody we had fired, and they had tried to extract us paying them out, and I would not do that, they spent 3 years investigating us. Over the 3 years, they did not find a single thing wrong. And normally when they would exit companies after they had interviewed them, they'd say pay $25 million and we'll give you an okay and no admission of guilt. They said for you, we'd done nothing wrong. And it wasn't management and finance that drove that, it was culture. A culture of every time I was in Russia saying there is no gray on right or wrong. I don't care what our channels do or say they do, we will not allow them to participate in activities that would embarrass us. And we fired our channels who did, including some channels that were probably owned by some very high Russian political positions. So culture was what saved us. Culture is who we are. I know every illness of every employee in our company that is life-threatening for the employee, their spouse, or their children, and therefore we're with them like no one else. I get a call on Christmas Eve about a mother who's losing her son in a hospital in Florida, and we talk through the night as that occurs, and we try to do everything we can to help. Culture, you have to walk the talk and drive it at the top. I don't recommend that's for everyone, but it's what we do uniquely.
Cisco took a decision many, many years ago, probably 15 to 20 years ago, to open its alternate headquarters in India.
Yes.
And I presume the 2 contenders were China and India at that point of time. Mm-hmm. What made you choose India, and has that decision paid off? And how has India changed now compared to what you saw many years ago?
So first of all, most companies never have a second headquarters. That if you're going to get ahead of the trends and look at what you're doing, it was important for me to focus on Why were you trying to have a second headquarters? And why I chose India was very simple. It was the people. India generates 600,000 top engineers a year. It's a democracy, etc. So I deliberately acquired the second headquarters here in India to focus on how do we build the next generation for digitization overall. So why did I choose it? The country, the culture, the engineers.
And how do you see India different today?
I actually, in hindsight, moved a little bit early on India. Market trends, I'm pretty good at reading them, but sometimes I'm early. It was a good engineering investment for us 12 years ago to do this, but the country never represented the market or the use of the technology that we developed here in country the way I hoped it would to be a model. However, 3 years ago with the election of Prime Minister Modi, I saw a leader that really was able to outline a vision almost like no one else in the world, and he is as good as you hear. And a willingness to do whatever it takes for the benefit of his country, a willingness to tie digitization of the country and partner with the players like Cisco in doing that in ways that his predecessor was not willing to do, was courageous on everything from goods and services tax to demonetization, etc. And I was willing to really bet with him in terms of that approach. So today, I think that I'm the biggest bull in India, and I think most everybody would agree. 3 years ago, that was controversial. Today, I think most people realize that it probably is going to be very accurate. Morgan Stanley the other day said they think on their research that India will grow at above 10% for the next decade every year on GDP, and that it will lead the entire world. So I think you are very blessed to have a leader who really gets this, but understand he reinvents himself and reinvents the country in the process. And he is truly, along with probably France and Israel, the most advanced digitization countries in the world in terms of tying that to the culture of the company.
Well, interestingly, I think the GDP growth numbers were announced today, and it was 6.7% versus 5.7%. So hopefully we'll get there at 10%.
Well, it's very simple. This is like making decisions as CEO. The decisions I make today will get me my results 3 years out. And so often as a CEO, you can fall into the trap of measuring your decision, what will have the effect on the next quarter, the quarter thereafter. The minute my competitors did that, I had them, because I would out-execute them thinking 3 to 5 years. This leader is fearless. He thinks about what's right for his future, he inspires hope, and then he goes for it. Now, obviously I'm a fan, but I've met every leader in the world, and I'm aging myself now 3, 4, 5 times. He's among the top 3, and if he executes as well as I believe that he will, he might be the best leader of my lifetime in terms of transition. I think is that good. But if he were running this company, thank you, if he were running this country based upon what would be GDP 1 quarter after he did demonetization or a goods and services tax, he would make the same mistake his predecessors did.
Okay.
And so it's like me on my acquisitions. You have to say, where do you want to be 3 years out? You have to be fearless in doing it. And if you're managing it for the next quarter or the quarter thereafter, or worrying about the next election, you'll never achieve greatness for your country.
Coming back to startups again.
Yes.
Macro to micro. 65% of software startups in the last 3 years have migrated to the US.
Yes.
I presume partially because of the US market space. And what do you think of that trend right now? How will it impact India?
So I did not know that number until you told me this about an hour ago, and the answer is that is a disaster. Let's start with the big picture. The big picture is digitization, artificial intelligence, automation everywhere is going to destroy 20 to 40% of the jobs as we know them today. That is inevitable. The large companies in India and around the world will not add headcount in total. There'll be some that will grow well, as many others will shrink or go out of business. And so it says all of your job growth of the future will be small businesses getting bigger and startups getting bigger. And so if you do not create an environment where startups really grow, you're never going to be able to employ the 1.2 million people per month that come into the market. And if the worst of all worlds happen, where you have areas like startup for software players, which is the fastest growth area in the industry, that the minute they hit a certain size, they feel they have to leave the country because the government won't do business with startups or the enterprise companies won't do business with startups, then you're never going to get the growth that you have to have for the future. So I think that's a real warning signal that something has to change.
So you're saying policy initiatives to open up the government, the private sector, the public sector to startups, which is not opened up today.
Well, I think that's one of the issues. When you're looking at a complex issue like this, it's never a single variable.
Right.
It's usually 5 to 7 variables in it. But it starts with the nation deciding, and this is a prime minister decision, I already know he's made the decision, that you're going to become a major startup country. Then you've got to say, for that to occur, what are the 4 to 7 programs that will really allow you to do that? And what we found in France as an example, and in Israel as well, is that if the government doesn't open up to startups and your enterprise companies don't open up to startups, then you will fail. What Israel did that many people don't understand, everybody knows Israel is the startup nation in the world, right? Do you know who is the primary early consumer of startup technologies over there? Their Defense Department.
Defense.
And yet, in some countries, France is an example, and India is an example, governments often will not do business with startups because a certain percentage of them will fail, and the government doesn't want to explain to its citizens why they did by somebody that failed. And same thing with enterprise companies. They are almost risk adverse on it. Well, 2 things have changed. First, you're never going to grow your startup community, and secondly, the innovation comes from the startups. And so if you don't do business with startups, and America's pretty good about doing business with startups, you're not going to innovate quick enough, but secondly, you're not going to have the engine you need for the future. So I think one of the elements, if we're really going to generate 1.2 million jobs, and almost all of those will come from startups or startup-like companies, if small business is getting bigger, you have to say, what are we going to change? And one thing that has to change is government has to do a lot more business across the board with startups, just like France did. Their postal service, their defense agencies, their civilian agencies, all the ministries started to open up. And then in a constructive way, we encouraged the enterprise customers to open up. Just to give you the numbers on France, it was the worst place in the world to do business in Europe. It was a place I would visit, but I would never locate a large workforce there, and I would never do startups there. And when their government, Hollande had the courage to do it, Macron was the economic minister who's now the president, Valls the prime minister, Laurent the defense minister, when they decided they were really going to change, and I believe that, I made the prediction that France would become the startup nation of Europe and it would be the best place to do business. Nobody, even my closest friends, thought I was close on that one. They said, John, you nailed most of these market transitions right, you're going to be really wrong on this one. Well, it was really fun this last 6 months when France became the startup nation in Europe. They blew past the UK and Germany. They weren't even in the top 5 ever before.
And this happened in how many years?
2.5 years.
So
they went from an average startup in high tech, as an example, venture cap-backed startups from 120 to 130 a year to 486. So it gives you an idea with the right support from government and the right commitment as a country that we're going to change, and it is a marketing effort to do that. The right support from venture capital. I helped attract the venture capital into France, how quickly things can change.
So what you're also saying is that even a large country like India, let's say maybe not in 2.5 years, but 3, 4, 5 years, can actually aim to become a startup hub like France.
I think 5 years is too long.
5 years is too long?
I think if the French can do it in 2.5, India ought to be able to do it in 2.
Okay. Well said.
And so should the US.
Shifting to more micro.
Okay.
Startups differentiate themselves on product, on pricing, on revenue models. And as you said, they have to reinvent themselves every day. What is it that magic which is required in a startup to constantly differentiate in the market space?
Well, there are 2 questions that you're asking me directly or indirectly. Let me start with the first one. What is actually disappointing when you go to a startup as somebody who's trying to coach and teach startups, or maybe even thinking about investing in them? When I ask them what is their strategy and their vision and what is their differentiation, and they're not able to answer it crisply, it's so disappointing.
It's not there.
Because you've got to understand your strategy very well. You've got to understand differentiation. If you're not dramatically differentiating in the market, you're not going to survive. And yet it will shock you how many times in dealing with a group of startups, I ask that question and they really don't have a good answer on what is it that there's really differentiation. I think in today's world, you've got to be so quick moving, probably at least 2 to 3 times the speed that I had to be when I took Cisco at 70 million in sales. You've got to keep your finger on the pulse of customers, and they'll tell you the changes you have to make, but you've got to have the courage to, probably going back to the reinvention question, every 3 to 4 years you have to reinvent yourself and your company, and you have to have the courage to move into new areas.
Excellent. You invested in the first company in India, Unifor, which I'm proud to say is also an IDG portfolio company. What made you decide in favor of Unifor? You saw probably a lot of companies, and what are those magic things which perhaps other companies can look forward to in the next 1 year to pitch to you?
Sure. So a series of questions. First, understand why I'm investing in India. I'm investing in India because I love the country, that the Prime Minister's vision I believe in very much, that I understand for that vision to come true, you've got to become the startup nation, and I understand that your current rate of startups are going to cause the country to not be successful. So if you're going to help be a part of that, either in terms of my personal commitment or as chairman of the U.S.-India Strategic Partnership Forum, we have to do things differently. And so I'm not only a believer in giving advice or mentoring or coaching, I'm a believer in backing it up with my own time, my own resources, including financial. So I felt that I needed to look at investing in India and picking one and probably what will grow to be 2 to 4 companies to invest in, champion, mentor, etc. And my decision criteria that's replicable is very similar like my acquisitions. It is there a company that is in the middle of a major market transition? That can be the way customers buy, it can be artificial intelligence, it can be security-like, etc. Is the CEO somebody that really is brilliant, wants to be coached, knows what they know, knows what they don't, etc.? Do they have the lighthouse customers like a MetLife and a Tata in there that are driving their direction? Do they have the right VC and the board behind them to help them transition through it? Do they have a chance of being 1 or 2 in their industry, not with 10% market share in a rapid growing industry, but with 40% plus market share in it? And when you find those criteria, that's when I decide to spend more time with them. I love giving advice and sharing and teaching. It's kind of what I enjoy at this stage of my life, and it is exciting. It's also fun to give advice and coaching, and then when there's a problem and I go home, I give it back to management at the end of the night. I sleep better that way, and it's different than when you're doing it yourself. But Unifor and the young CEO, Umesh, were just the right approach for me. They're in a customer experience focus of the market, which is in transition, because most customers do not believe the businesses interfacing to them really do a good job of customer service, and yet most companies think they do a great job. So there's clearly a mismatch. You see the transition around the value of speech analytics, of a virtual speech assistant capability, biometrics in it. All those are in transitions, artificial intelligence, natural language processing, etc. And so all this came together with a young CEO I really believe in and is very coachable and very proud of what Umesh is doing. I think you feel the same way about him.
Absolutely.
But I need a role model that I can say this is what more have to do, and then I hope he decides not to leave the country and not to, at a certain size, be bought, but really take it public and be an example for others to do.
One last question. I can see timing being flashed at me.
Okay.
You've met a lot of leaders. You're a exceptional leader yourself. You've met many other leaders. What's the one advice which you have liked, which you got?
Let me expand and maybe use it as an example to summarize what we've covered. I've had the chance to meet many great leaders around the world. I've known 9 U.S. Secretary of States, just to date myself, and I've known a number of them that were just brilliant. But when I think about leaders that have been amazing, even though I'm a moderate Republican, which is an endangered species in the U.S., especially in California, President Clinton was amazing. He got the internet era. He was a very curious, tremendous reader. He had the courage of his views, much like Prime Minister Modi does. He outlined the internet era, and he said this would not destroy jobs, it would grow it. During his 8 years in office, the GDP grew 34%. The average American household income went up 24%. It was the last time America had a raise was 2000. He generated 22.5 million jobs in a country that has only 320 million people at that time. He was very good. Shimon Peres in Israel was really an amazing leader in terms of how he brought the country through economic times, built the military, being very candid, and then focused on peace. The advice that I got from leaders varied dramatically, but the one that might surprise the people in this room was that at Wang, and I constantly ask every time I meet a good leader, what can they teach me? And I word it nicer than that, but what can I learn? What were their best lessons learned that I could pass on to my team and others? And it was a lawyer out of the largest law firm in Michigan, and I just made the largest sell to him that we had ever made to a law firm, and he was about to retire, and he was spending his own money to put in these systems to prepare his law firm to survive and grow. So I said, what would be the advice you would give to me as a young aspiring leader that I could use again and again throughout my career? He looked at me and he said, John, before you take time to go in an important meeting, take time to go to the bathroom. And at first I was disappointed by his answer. And then he said, that will become more important too as you get older. I thought about it a little bit more, and this guy was wicked smart, and I knew it. And so we were walking down the hall. We'd walked about another 30 yards, and he said, do you understand what I just told you? And I said, yes, sir, I got it. When you're finishing a meeting, you want to finish the meeting and summarize your action items immediately, not be revisiting those over a period of time. So you want to take time to summarize it, get them in your mind, know what the follow-up actions need to be. Secondly, when you go into your next meeting, you don't want to go into it with any unusual pressures. The example was go to the bathroom, but it really means to relieve those pressures before you go into it, because you're not going to be effective in the meeting.
Right.
And the third thing is you want to go into your next meeting well prepared, and from the very beginning know what you want to do and focus. And I said that to him, and he said, you nailed it. And it's one of the most important lessons I've ever learned in life. So if you don't remember anything that I've talked about tonight, remember it's important when you go into an important meeting to take time to go to the bathroom.
With that, John, thank you so much. A big hand to John.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure, and I think the message which you give is startups are crucial to the country. It's crucial to the GDP growth, crucial to employment, and I think with the intervention which you're doing at policy, government, and at the operating level with startups, I'm sure India will be a startup nation very shortly.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I believe in you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much.